Here we are with a piece of the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall divided communist East Germany from capitalist West Germany during the Cold War. It came down in the 1980s. Today we're going to talk about the political function of boundaries. I'm Mr. Coulter, and this is Human Geography.
As we continue to explore political geography, we're moving into 4.5, the function of political boundaries, where we're going to get into taking those boundaries that we learned about yesterday and applying them to how they work. So political boundaries often coincide with cultural, national, or economic divisions. However, some boundaries are created by demilitarized zones or policy, like the Berlin Conference. A great example of this is the boundary on the 38th parallel. Yesterday we talked about geometric boundaries, and that is one because it was just picked on the 38th parallel. But it was the line at the end of the Korean War where North and South Korea decided to divide the Korean people. That's how they called an armistice. And they call that the Demilitarized Zone, also called the DMZ. So if we look at this map of the Koreas and the boundary, you can see the DMZ is in green. It is on either side of the military demarcation line, which each side gets 2 kilometers away from the DMZ in order to control. So they try to keep citizens away from that line in South Korea to keep them safe. Because they agreed to put down their arms but not in the war, it is still considered a war. So the demilitarized zone is a zone to try to preserve peace between the two sides. This is an excellent Vox video that I'll put a link to in the video, but it talks about Territorial Sea and the lines that go along the water. So I'm going to explain that briefly. So there are 3 divisions according to the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law in Sea. So the UN actually laid out 3 ways that we measure whose territory is what at sea. The first is Territorial Sea. So 12 nautical miles from your coast is counted as your territory. So if somebody brings a military ship into that 12 miles from your coast, like if off the coast of Florida, a submarine came within 12 miles, that would be considered our territory, and it would be like justified to go to war with that person if you get within those 12 miles of the sea. The next water-based boundary is known as the contiguous zone. That is 24 miles from your boundary. So if you actually look at the land and you go 24 nautical miles from your land, you can impose laws and regulations on that sea, but it is not considered your actual territory. So there's no standard rule for resolving conflicts, but you can do things like tax people who go through there or make sure that sanitary laws are followed outside of that sea. So that 24 miles from your land is still considered part of your control. And then even further out from that is the exclusive economic zone, the EEZ, exclusive economic zone. That is the 200 nautical miles outside of your land that you can use for fishing, mining, oil exploration, and you can use any of those resources found in your EEZ for your profit. But you can't like tax people who go through the EEZ or declare war on them. It's just an area where you are able to get the resources of the ocean. So just a quick recap of that, of the United Nations Law of the Sea. Within 12 nautical miles of your land is considered your territory. 24 nautical miles of your land is a part of that zone where you can tax people, but it's not explicitly considered your territory, and that's called the contiguous zone. So that is connected to your land. And then the 200 miles from your land is known as the EEZ, or the exclusive economic zone. That is where you can get resources from that sea, but it's not considered your land or territory. So I'll put the link up because they talk about how China has been building islands in order to expand their economic zone. So let's talk about how we draw boundaries. So there are 3 ways that we draw boundaries. The first is the definition. The definition is when you define a boundary by creating a document that talks about the exact landmarks of that boundary. So that is where you actually write out specifically the deed of the land, and it says using landmarks where it is. So it's a description using like written word of where it is. So that is the first one. That is the definition of a boundary. The delineation of a boundary, so when you delineate a boundary, that is when cartographers draw a map and they actually place the boundary on a map. So you can see the boundary on a map, and that is one way to mark where the boundary is by physically drawing it on a map. We can see here a cartographer drawing the rivers, but if they were to draw those boundaries on a map, that would be the delineation of that boundary. And then demarcation is where you physically mark the boundary on the ground. So if you use steel posts, pillars, fences, walls, whatever that is, the demarcation is where you physically put it on the ground on the land. So as you can see right here, this would be a farmer demarcating their land by using a barbed wire fence to show where their land ended. So just to recap all of that, the way that we draw boundaries, we can do the definition, which is first. That is when you create a document that shows what it is by describing landmarks. So this is like when we bought our house and we got a deed. It literally said from this part of the street back to the creek and 5 yards further is part of our land, and it was written out for us to understand what our boundaries were. The delineation is when a map maker draws the line on a map so that you can understand. So when we bought our house, we also got a delineated map of our land so that we could see with trees and everything in the map where our property extended to. And then the demarcation is when you mark on the ground in the real world where the line is. So this would be like when neighbors they try to cut their grass to demarcate which part is theirs. That is demarcation. So that line, if you can see on the ground, that is demarcation. It would be nice if boundaries were always clearly laid out and there was never a dispute over what the boundary is, but often in the real world, that is not the case. We see that there are a lot of conflicts over boundaries, and we're going to go into all 4 of those. Land and maritime boundaries and international agreements can influence national or regional identity and encourage or discourage international or internal interactions and disputes over resources. So those disputes often lead to these issues over different boundaries. So let's go through them. The first type of dispute is an allocation dispute. This is where neighboring states argue over the distribution of resources over a boundary. So it's where you share a resource and then you have a dispute over the use of it. The US and Mexico has this sometimes, with our boundary being the Rio Grande River, where it's like who gets to use the water if people are dumping chemicals into it. That water is a resource that people debate over. One of the best examples in world history was the Gulf War, which was fought between Iraq and Kuwait that eventually the United States got involved in. But you can see it became an issue because Kuwait was drilling at an angle in a slant well, which means that they were drilling sideways to get oil out from under a boundary that was in Iraq. So what happened is the oil field, the majority of it was in Iraq, but some of the oil was in Kuwait. But Kuwait started draining the oil that was considered belonging to Iraq as an allocational dispute. So they went to war over this because Iraq felt like Kuwait was stealing their oil. Another dispute is a definitional dispute. That is a focus on the legal language of a boundary. So people argue over how it's described. Sometimes this is in the wording that's used. People argue over that. Or if the landmark that is described moves or is no longer visible, that is something that can cause a dispute. So an example of this is in the border of Argentina and Chile. On the southern part, their border goes over glaciers. And as the glaciers change and melt over time or move, that makes it harder to decide what the original intent of the boundary was when you read the definition. So the definition is when you argue over the legal language of the boundary. The next type is a locational dispute. That is where the delineation and demarcation are in dispute. So maybe it's been drawn on a map a certain way, but then when you look at the ground, it has changed some. So you can see this sign where somebody draws an arrow to the demarcation and says, "You stole my land." But we see this sometimes where someone will have a clearly laid out border on a map, but then it doesn't always match up with what's marked on the ground. So locational is where the demarcation of the ground is different than the delineation. Finally, an operational dispute is when neighboring states disagree over the policies applied along a boundary. A big case of this is immigration. Countries all over the world have issues with immigration and people moving over boundaries. Some states don't want people to leave, like North Korea. Some states are fighting to keep people out. We saw this a lot in the migration and the refugee crisis in Eastern European countries, where they started to put up fences to block refugees from coming over their boundary. So it's where neighboring states disagree over policies applied along a boundary. And like we said, immigration is a big one for this. So to recap the different conflicts over boundaries, we have allocational, which is about the resources at or under the boundary. Remember, under the ground still counts as part of the line. Definitional, where they argue over the definition in legal language in the agreement. Locational, which is where the delineation or demarcation doesn't match up and people dispute over it. And then operational, where neighboring states argue over the policies that are applied along a boundary. That is it for topic 4.5, which is the politics of boundaries. We learned a lot about how we decide on boundaries, the international water boundaries, and then different disputes over boundaries. We'll continue to learn about the way that states are pulled together or pushed apart and the different boundaries around the world as we continue this unit. That's just one step in our journey to better understand our world. I'm Mr. Coulter, and that was Human Geography.